These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
Gloria Emeagwali writes in Africa and the Academy, challenging hegemonic discourses on Africa, that colonialism was a system of administration and a process of exploitation geared towards creating capitalist relations and the economic and sociological aggrandizement of the colonizer through covert and overt psychological, economic, and social mechanisms. Accordingly, this necessitated the subordination of knowledge systems and distorted the epistemologies of the colonized African to the logic and dynamics of colonial production systems and hierarchies. The aim of this process produced a culture of dependence and attempted to destroy potential centers of resistance to colonial power and hegemony. The institution that this process of exploitation finds fertile ground to proliferate in its most articulate expression of contradictions is the academy, the university, not only on the continent of Africa, but across the world. Gloria Emeagwali adds clarity to this reality when she writes that the logic of colonial and also postcolonial capitalism was to undermine indigenous technical skill and expertise so as to create an economic milieu favorable for the continued domination and exploitation of a colonized people. To create and recreate the self-perpetuating systems of subjugation of African humanity, the biopolitical production of life itself is the logic. To repurpose the function of learning, sharpening the effect and affect of the colonial logic to be birthed and rebirthed in the minds of African people. The colonization of the mind is thereby the arresting of the imagination to impair the ability to not simply become conscious, but critically conscious, is vital to point out. Sabilo in Duluth Gashini in Empire, Global Coloniality and Subjectivity adds more clarity to this reality by highlighting that Western education emerged in Africa as one of the technologies of subjugation. Instead of higher education becoming a medium to transfer the needed technological skills from the West into Africa, it became largely a laboratory for Westernization that produced Africans who were alienated from their societies and cultures. Therefore, the necessity to identify the targeting of culture as the primary mechanism of imperial logic is vital to highlight. Cultural transformation of higher education entails a changing of the ideology of knowledge as well as the sociology of knowledge. At the ideological level of knowledge, the aim is to repudiate the centering of the European colonial paradigm that continues to reduce African peoplehood as objects rather than subjects of knowledge. At the sociological level of knowledge, the quest is to enable African peoples globally to take charge of academic mechanisms so as to produce knowledge that is relevant to the future of Africa. Today, we present a recent conversation with Paul Zeleza, where we explore the African University, the politics of knowledge production and access. Paul Zeleza is and has been at the forefront of conversations around African history and intellectual traditions, the role of the university, knowledge production, and Pan-Africanism, as well as a number of other points of inquiry. Professor Paul Zeleza is currently Associate Provost and North Star Distinguished Professor at Case Western Reserve University. Professor Zeleza was also recent past Vice Chancellor and Professor of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the United States International University, Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. He has given lectures around the world and has taught and/or served as an administrator at 12 universities in 6 countries on 3 continents and within the Caribbean region. He has published more than 300 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters and reviews, short stories, and publicly accessible essays, as well as authored or edited 28 books, several of which have won international awards. He is a leader in academic governance, policy analysis, as well as an expert in African, gender, diaspora, and development studies. If you have not engaged the extensive work of Paul Zeleza, we invite you to do so. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Enjoy the program. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Professor Paul Zeleza. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well, and thank you for asking me to join you.
No, this is absolutely, there's certain instances that we mark in our lives, and certain instances, and this is one of those highlights, being able to be engaged in a conversation at this particular juncture in our historical epic, is to engage in a conversation about the African university and its future, its past, its present, but its future in the context of a global society, a global world that is in absolute chaos. To be able to think with you in public out loud is just one of the highlights of my life. And I'm glad we're actually being able to share this with the public. Again, thank you for, obviously. And of course, as we were talking before, there's so many connections that we have, and that's the way that it usually happens when you're doing work, particularly for Africa and the African world. You're doing a specific type of work, quality and work that is really critical. The connections are very, very close. They're closer than we think. And so with that being said, again, thank you for joining us, and let's jump right into the conversation, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
This notion of the African university, and it's very important in the context of this time, the context of education, the context of recolonialization and imperialism that is being, kind of rebranded in some ways, but still old in other ways. Let me just put this broad question to you. Is the university, as a Western construct, beneficial to the current and future needs of continental African communities?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very good question and very complex question. First of all, I think the university itself, we need to unpack it because there is a tradition of higher education on the African continent, which goes back many centuries, in some cases more than 1,000 years. And what we have established during the colonial era is not the first time that you're getting higher education. So the issue of contextualization of what is the university is extremely important. So some of the world's oldest universities, as we know, in Africa, the Ezituna madrasa established in Tunisia in around 732. Then you have, of course, the University of Karawini, forgive my pronunciation, in Fez, Morocco, 1859, founded by a woman, Al-Fahiri. And that university, of course, attracted students and scholars from Andalusian Spain to West Africa. Then, of course, we know the establishment of Al-Azhar in Cairo, almost the same year that Cairo was being established. And that university, those three universities are still in existence. Al-Azhar is one of Africa's largest universities today, with more than 300,000 students. And then, of course, you also had the University of Sankore in West Africa, established in the 12th century. Unfortunately, that one hasn't survived, but we know from the historical records that taught a lot of subjects that were popular at that time: theology, logic, astronomy, astrology, grammar, rhetoric, you name it, history and geography. And it's important to understand the legacies of this tradition for Africa and for the world. So as I noted, these universities still exist. At least 3 of them still exist. And more importantly, we have also seen in recent times the establishment of Islamic universities that in some ways are patterned or modeled on these ancient Islamic universities. And then thirdly, it's important to understand also that what we call the Western University that was introduced in Africa in the 19th century bore a lot of Islamic influences. So for example, a lot of the knowledges, as we know from history, that are going to be integrated into the European knowledge system and the universities were really inheritances transmitted by Muslims. Many of them from Africa. So a huge corpus of knowledge, rationalism, the investigative approach to knowledge, the elaborate disciplinary architecture of knowledge, and notions of individual scholarship and the idea of the college. All of these, which became very central features of the European university, were really inherited from the Islamic university, from the Muslim scholars that were part of European history from the 8th century. So we need to, as I said, to unpack the notion of the university. Obviously, during the colonial period, we are going to have a new architecture of higher education introduced in some of the colonies that bears the imprint of the European, traditions, and then, of course, after independence, some of these, a lot of more universities are going to be established. What I find interesting when you look at the history of higher education in Africa is how limited higher education was during the colonial period. So in 1959, the year before, 1960, the year of African independence, because so many countries got independence in that year, 17 of them. There were only 76 universities on the entire continent, the majority in South Africa and Egypt. And then you had a scattering in Liberia College, of course, established in the 19th century, and one of its principals was one of the great Pan-Africanists, Edward Blyden, and of course in Sierra Leone, and so on. But, there were very few universities. A lot of them are being established towards the end of the colonial era. So, Makerere, Legon in Ghana, Ibadan, in Nigeria, Khartoum, they're really sort of products of the post-war period as part of decolonization, when the colonial state needed more educated people than was the case prior to that. And it was also an answer to the agitation of the nationalists for higher education. And it was a soap, as it were, to satisfy them. But the point is that there were very few universities. So the real, if one was to use this term, the golden period of higher education in Africa comes after independence. That's when the bulk of Africa's higher education institutions are established. The number increases from 76 in 1960 to 294 by 1979. And then by 1999, you have 784 universities. And by last year, you had 1,690. The majority by then, last year, were private. So the issues have been, in my view, that the colonial universities, like the colonial economies, were extroverted in that they are physical, they are organizational, they are administrative, and their disciplinary architecture was modeled on the imperial metropole. They were, in other words, really branch campuses of metropolitan universities. In fact, a lot of the new British universities, Makerere, Ibadan, Legon, and so on, were really affiliated with the University of London. And then the post-colonial universities, their challenge has been, how do you indigenize and at the same time maintain international connections? So that really is the big question that these institutions have been dealing with, and we can follow from there. But thank you for that question. I thought it was excellent.
No, and this is a very important contestation which you just actually laid out, this indigeneity, the indigenizing, at the same time being able to maintain a international connection, right? So this is a very important. Could you speak a little bit more about that particular challenge? Because to me, it seems like there's the curriculum question in the context of the colonial curriculum. But also there is a labor question in the context of global economy. There's a resource extraction question. So what you just laid out are multiple things. Could you talk a little bit more and expand upon that indigeneity, that indigenization, and the importance of knowledge? Because you just laid out a history of knowledge already being on the continent.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. There are multiple layers, or multiple angles in which you can look at this question. One is exactly what you just said, and that is the curriculum. How do you have a curriculum that is responsive to the needs, the challenges, the problems, the aspirations, the opportunities, the visions of African peoples in their different locations, in their localities, in their nations, in their regions, and of course, continentally, and for me, globally, including the African diaspora. So how do you have a curriculum that responds to their historic and contemporary realities? And in terms of research, address the challenges that they face in their multiple social and spatial boards. So those are big questions. And in addressing those issues, you obviously have to use methodologies and be inspired by values and visions that are pertinent, speak to the African peoples. So in terms of the curriculum, certainly in the social sciences and the humanities, where the contestations are particularly strong for obvious reasons. You're studying us as human beings in particular locations with particular histories, and the ways in which you understand the methodologies you use, the theories that you use, the perspectives that you use, will of course influence the kind of analysis and interpretations you're going to have. So there is a lot of intellectual contestations over methodology, over theory, over perspective. And there are also, of course, going to be contestations over the ways in which this knowledge is packaged for education, namely teaching, and how it is packaged in terms of policy for our governments, our civil society organizations, for our international and intergovernmental organizations. And it's therefore important for African scholars and African educators, both on the continent and in the diaspora, to really face squarely these challenges. They are epistemological challenges. There are also fundamentally ontological challenges. What does it mean to be, to become, and to live as a person of African descent? So there are philosophical questions, there are political questions, there are ideological questions, there are intellectual questions, and therefore the contestations over the curriculum is going to continue. It's been there for a long time. What I think we have to do more consciously is really to educate ourselves as people of African descent intellectually about the different African, what Mudimbe used to call, V.Y. Mudimbe called the African libraries. There is a tendency, which is unfortunate but understandable, to assume there is one African tradition of knowing, of knowledge production. There has never been, and there will not be one. There will be multiple ways of knowing, multiple ways of constructing knowledges. And in Mudimbe's construct of libraries, to use that concept, one could argue that there have been at least 4 key libraries in Africa's intellectual history. The first library in terms of identifiable library, body of knowledge, is for lack of a better term, the Christian library, which goes back to the beginnings of Christianity. People forget that some of the key church fathers, key theologians, key thinkers in the construction of Christian doctrine were people from the African continent, St. Augustine and so on. And that library is extremely important for us to understand its development, its legacies. And secondly is the Islamic library, which I talked about briefly with regards to the Islamic universities. This is a huge body of knowledge that has been going on for at least the last 1600 years. And then, of course, you have the third library, which is, for lack of a better term, I call it the griot library, what some people call traditional. As a historian, I'm reluctant to use the word tradition because the issue is tradition at what point in time? Is it the 19th century? Is it the 15th century? Is it the 5,000 years ago? So that griot library, of course, has been, it is very complicated in its own ways, and it has its own sort of knowledges and protocols of creating and constructing and remembering and disseminating the knowledges. And then, of course, you have the colonial library, which comes in with colonial education and so on and so forth. And a lot of us are really hung up on the colonial library, and understandably so, because it's so immediate, it's so recent. But as in terms of intellectual histories, I think it's important to realize this is just one of other libraries in Africa. And our challenge, frankly, is how do we really understand these libraries in all their diversity, their complexity, and even contradictions, and then construct empowering knowledges for 21st century Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. So the issue of curriculum, the issue of knowledge production, and the issue of dissemination of knowledges is really a critical part. It's not just a question of sort of counterposing indigeneity as one construct versus foreignness or coloniality as another construct. It's a lot more complicated than that. And I think we need to try to engage these complexities. But of course, at the school level, it means that we have to try to write textbooks that show our students, our young people, the complexities of Africa's intellectual traditions in ways that make sense, of course, to different age groups, and that are empowering. Taiwo, the philosopher is now, I think, in Washington, D.C. there, recently wrote an essay which is very interesting. The very way we construct the periodization of African history, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial, is extremely dangerous. Because what it does is posit the colonial as the central feature of our existence. As Ajayi, the Nigerian historian, put it in the 1960s, the colonial is a parenthesis, is a footnote in the long history of Africa and Africans. And obviously it's the most immediate, and it's understandable why we focus on that. But I think we need to engage in long durée histories to understand that the colonial, of course, was important, but it's not the sum total of our being as human beings on that complicated continent called Africa. So I have a very conflicted relationship with notions of coloniality as determinants of everything about us, and therefore positioning decoloniality as the primary sort of instrument of trying to deal with that reality. I think our reality is a lot more complicated than that.
No, and you raised a very, very important point, this notion of the decoloniality, efforts to recover, identify and recover, but also knowledge production in the context of a time construct that arrests the way that we think about ways of knowing, and which is in this context of a coloniality, to arrest the human in a particular point. But that comes with the processes of control. in order to control someone, you have to freeze them in a particular point, define them, and then set them on a stage. You know, you could speak a little bit more about the decoloniality and the importance of that. Is also a rejection of a time construct and the way that knowledge is produced, because you also talked about the embodied knowledge that is that the libraries, right? You know, the saying that when an elder dies, a library dies with them, you know, those types of things. You talk a little bit more about some of the efforts. I know that you have been very, very involved in a lot of, you know, decolonizing and also really kind of, you know, situating a Pan-African university concept that I would probably kind of determine and that hopefully we'll be able to talk about. But talk a little bit more about those efforts to decolonize. Of course, we had the Fees Must Fall movement at one particular point. The Roads Must Fall. So there are some efforts. Could you talk about the history of that decolonizing efforts coming out of the anti-colonialist movement? And then we'll kind of move forward to posit our question in this time construct, this frozen time construct.
Right. Yeah, so maybe a couple of ways of approaching that question. First of all, just to, you know, sort of map out how knowledge is produced. What are the dynamics of knowledge production? And for lack of a better, you know, way architecture of doing this, I tend to talk of the 4 I's of knowledge production. One is, you know, sort of intellectual traditions, and therefore that's why it's important, in my view, to immerse ourselves in intellectual traditions of Africa, and also as part of that agenda to immerse ourselves in global intellectual traditions. And of course, Africa has been engaging not just with Europe, but with Asia for a very long time. And therefore, and certainly now, in terms of Africa's global engagements, Asia is becoming extremely important. China, for example, is Africa's biggest trading partner now since 2009, you know, after having replaced the United States. And therefore, it's not just knowing our multiple intellectual traditions and multiple global intellectual traditions, including the European one, but also other traditions. Because we are a global people, we should not be reduced to a people who have simply been, you know, sort of confined to one space. We know, of course, that's not true. But also, we know it's not true that the modern connections between Africans and the rest of the world are not products of the European moment. Africa has been relating with Asia, you know, for centuries before Europe became the center of the global world system. So that's the first thing, the intellectual tradition. The second is, of course, institutional dynamics. The institutions, how they are constructed, how they are funded, how they governed, how they produce, you know, and employ, you know, knowledge producers, you know, matters a great deal. And therefore, this requires us to understand what are the challenges facing knowledge producing institutions occupied by peoples of African descent on the continent as well as outside the continent, because that will determine the kinds of knowledges, the kinds of opportunities, the kinds of you know, dynamics that impact the knowledges that have been produced. You know, just a simple example. You know, in certain institutions, we see it in this country now. Even talking about critical race theory is supposed to be criminal. You know, because there are a lot of political interests in trying to obfuscate understanding of how this country really operates. And that, you know, is sometimes internalized in institutions through governing boards that begin to impose certain you know, conditions in employing certain faculty. So those institutional dynamics are extremely important to understand. And thirdly is ideological dynamics. The example I just gave is part of an ideological dynamics that gets infused into institutional dynamics. And the ideologies that reign at a particular time are going to influence the ways in which we do scholarship. So before feminism was, you know,
We are currently listening to a conversation I recently had with Professor Paul Zeleza, where we explore the African University and the politics of knowledge production and access. Paul Zeleza is and has been at the forefront of conversations around African history and intellectual traditions, the role of the university knowledge production and Pan-Africanism, as well as a number of other points of inquiry. Professor Paul Zeleza is currently Associate Provost and North Star Distinguished Professor at Case Western Reserve University. Professor Zeleza was also recent past Vice Chancellor and Professor of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the United States International University, Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. He has given lectures around the world and has taught and or served as an administrator at 12 universities in 6 countries on 3 continents and within the Caribbean region. He has published more than 300 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters and reviews, short stories, and publicly accessible essays, as well as authored or edited 28 books, several of which have won international awards. He is a leader in academic governance, policy analysis, as well as an expert in African, gender, diaspora, and development studies. If you have not engaged the extensive work of Paul Zeleza, we invite you to do so. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Enjoy the program.
So before feminism was, the kind of movement that it became in the 1960s, 1970s, and later on, studying women, whether in sociology or history or literature, was not an important aspect. And then with feminism and the entry of more women into institutions of higher education, they begin to ask, why are we not there? Why are we silent? Are we silenced in these texts? And therefore, the challenge to androcentric studies in the humanities and social sciences began to be mounted by feminist scholarship. It was a product of the feminist movement, and which then affected how research is being done, just like the civil rights movement in the United States and then the nationalist movement in Africa led to the studying of African peoples in ways that was not conceivable before those movements became what they are. So the ideological dynamics need to be understood as well. And then finally, it seems to me there is always the fourth eye, that is the individual dynamics. All of us as scholars are inscripted by our various biographies, social biographies, our gender, our race, our nationality, our religion, our proclivities, whatever it is, influences the kinds of scholarship that we do. In fact, fundamentally, if you really dig deep into why people choose certain topics in their study, it is really connected in very profound, sometimes unconscious ways to their own social biographies. So all those forces come together to influence the kinds of knowledge production. So when we are doing, sort of an archive of an archival analysis of knowledge production and the debates and the contests that have erupted, we have to understand the interplay of these 4 forces, in my view. Now, it's not surprising that in the 1960s, even the nomenclature, the language we used, in the 1960s and 70s, we used the term decolonization. It's interesting that we are now using the terminology decoloniality, and it's emerging out of a particular historical geography, a historical geography of post-apartheid South Africa, in which these issues are extremely potent because they are part of the post-apartheid dispensation. Now, those of us from the other parts of the continent, of course, we battled similar questions, but we did not use that terminology, decoloniality. We called it decolonization. And Thandika Nkandawire, who I'm sure talked about the five historic agendas of decolonization. And this was a sort of a multi-pronged agenda. One, of course, was decolonization of independence, rather, of the Pan-Africanist movement, the nationalist movement. One was decolonization in its multiple iterations: economic, political, intellectual, existential, if you will, and so epistemic and existential. And then, of course, nation building. How do you build a community of people in a certain historical geography called a nation state? Infuse the states that were colonially created with a sense of nationhood. Again, a very complicated agenda. And then thirdly, of course, the whole question of development, which has been the preoccupation of African elites and African people's material well-being. And this, of course, speaks to how they were deprived during the colonial period and the struggles to overcome the huge backlog of material under development, starting with the slave trade, with colonialism, and of course, later on with neo-colonial regimes. And then the issue of democratization, the issue of empowerment, the issue of inclusion, the issue of participation, the issue of belonging to a community, a polity, however you designate that polity at an institutional level. To what extent are our institutions authoritarian or democratic in terms of governance? To what extent are countries authoritarian, and so on and so forth? So that issue of democratization, not simply at the political level in terms of the state, but also in terms of organizational politics, including universities. And then, of course, the whole issue of regional integration, of Pan-Africanism, and so on and so forth, in which, to what extent are the knowledges we're trying to produce, the systems we're trying to produce, speaking not only to our local realities, wherever we are located, but also speaking to the needs and interests in solidarity with other peoples of African descent elsewhere, on the continent as well as abroad. So for me, the decolonization agenda that people like Thandika and Kandawire talk about, and some of us talked about in our works in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, is extremely important in the debates on decoloniality, which sometimes, and it's not necessarily because people are trying to be restricted to a particular moment, which of course you expect them to be. But sometimes I worry that some of these debates do not tie to earlier debates, which are very, very old in the pantheon or in the archive of African thought. I always encourage my students to read, your Blyden's, your Douglases, and so on and so forth. You'll find that a lot of the issues we're dealing with today were issues that our ancestors, intellectual ancestors in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries worked on. So one of the things I would like to see is much more contextualization, much more connectedness of these debates. Fees must fall, and decolonizing knowledges in a post-apartheid South Africa with those debates, earlier debates on decolonization of the continent in its multiple dynamics or dimensions of coloniality and colonization and so on.
And that's one of the things that I try to center, a lot of the work that, I do myself, but also the collective in the context of Africa Will Know Project. And also there's an access issue here too with, these conversations. Could you talk a little bit about the access to these collaborative, because we're doing it right now, right? And and it's this creating a way of thinking, informing and recovering and talking about, historic, but also trying, having a conversation about the moment now and thinking towards the future. Mm-hmm. There are these pockets. There should be obviously more collaborative, particularly with our comrades and colleagues on the continent of Africa in institutions and outside of institutions as well. I think that's important. one of the things, once we talk about, as we move to access, I couldn't help but think about the way that the individual is defined and how it's contextualized in Western European thought that comes into contradiction to the forms and ways of being, the forms of knowledge and the ways of being on the continent of Africa as well. So what about that extraction of the individual, right? This you know, students are going to school for their individual,
right.
you know, socioeconomic advancement. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So first of all, in terms of, I think you're absolutely right in terms of pockets of access. So the issue of access, and that's why the fees must fall movement is extremely important. It is talking about the, you know, how many people really have access to higher education? That's the first question. Connected to that, of course, is the question of affordability. How many people can really afford higher education? And connected with that is the issue we've been talking about: what kind of education are they exposed to? What kind of values is that education giving them? Are those values ones that will empower them as individuals, or empower them as members of communities and society, and provide a collective basis for transformation of our societies? Now, on all of these, you know, there are severe challenges. If you don't mind, let me share with you some data, because I've talked about these issues in many forums. So in terms of access to higher education, it's extremely limited on the African continent. So, you know, I don't use in my own work sub-Saharan, because I think it's a Eurocentric construct. But, you know, a lot of the international data tends to talk about that. So in sub-Saharan Africa, enrollment ratios for tertiary is about 9%. So 9% of young people aged 18 to 24 go to universities. In North Africa, it's about 33%. If you combine the two, it's about 13, 14%. 45% of tertiary students on the African continent are in North Africa. The world average is 38%. For the developed countries, it's 77%. For a country like South Korea, which is used as to beat Africa up, because people argue South Korea was developmentally similar to many African countries in 1960, but now it has left the continent behind. South Korea is 96%. So there is a huge backlog of inaccessibility to higher education on the African continent. So there is definitely a profound need to expand access, to grow the number of higher education institutions. So that's simply one reality that we have to grapple with, that not enough young people are getting access to higher education. And that has all sorts of implications for the continent in terms of the development of human capital, in terms of taking advantage of the youth bulge, turning it turning the explosion of the African population into a demographic dividend. Africa is in a very interesting moment historically. It's for the next 3 decades, if not for the rest of this century, we are going to have the world's largest labor force. That's a huge asset. But for that asset to be realized, there is need for skilling that asset, educating those young people, providing them high quality education. So, and that's a developmental boon that cannot be wasted, should not be wasted. The other issue is even the ones who can go to college, how many of them have resources to pay? The access question. And what has happened since the 1980s, the turn of the 1980s, not only just in Africa, but across the world, including the United States, is the neoliberal agenda in which education has been was turned from a public good into a private good, in which the cost of education increasingly falling on the heads of students and their families, and no longer the state. You can see that story in every country, the United States, Kenya, you name it. And this also means that kids from poor backgrounds, peasant backgrounds, working class backgrounds, lower middle class backgrounds, find it extremely difficult to get education, higher education. And I've done a lot of research on funding of higher education, and it really breaks your heart to see how the state subvention, whether you're talking of the US or African countries, per student has progressively declined over the last 3 decades. Just recently, last week or 2 weeks ago, the budget in Kenya for higher education was reduced by 20%. It was already very low and not able to support these institutions. So the issue of financing these institutions, which in turn affects who has access and who can afford, is extremely important, and we have to deal with that issue. And then, of course, the other issue is access to knowledge that is already there. But before you even talk about access to knowledge that is already there, which involves, how many journals can you subscribe to in your libraries? Before you talk about that is, production, access to the production of knowledge. And in this area, again, we are not doing very well. There are huge discrepancies. In 2019, the latest figures show, we have the latest figures for 2019, only 3.5% of global knowledge scholarly production was coming from the African continent. Only 3.5%. This is less than Canada with 3.6%. And Asia, which is now the world leader in knowledge production, is 48%. So we need to build, strengthen, enhance, whatever word you want to use, our research infrastructures, research resources, to enable our students, our faculty, and our institutions to produce knowledges that address the pressing issues, the pressing challenges, the aspirations of African peoples. And this then also translates into the whole question of the access to the knowledge that is already there, being produced elsewhere. And what has happened in the last 30, 40 years is very, very concerning. And that is the ways in which knowledge has become increasingly proprietary. And a lot of us publish in these so-called prestigious journals. All of them are behind paywalls. And of course, as you know, there is a movement, the open, the open knowledge movement, open access movement, to make that, knowledges which are funded by governments, funded by universities, funded by all sorts of agencies, to be readily accessible. And there's been a lot of resistance by these big, huge multinational companies that are in the knowledge business. So that's another issue that we have to deal with. And all these dynamics lead to a situation whereby the opportunities for circulation of ideas, circulation of knowledge become severely constrained. And this, in my view, calls on us to do a number of things. One is to strengthen our own outlets. So I'm a very strong advocate for creating and publishing in outlets that our intellectual communities have control, and make no apologies about it. Obviously, still doing whatever rigorous standards of review that are required for credible scholarship. But that agenda of creating, controlling our own spaces of knowledge production is absolutely imperative. Secondly, it's also useful, and your program is an example of that, of creating forums for the dissemination of knowledge to the general public. Because not everybody goes to university, first of all, and even if they do, they are not necessarily studying the kinds of questions that will affect their life when they're working and when they're living and when they're engaging with people. So we need outlets, broadcast outlets, online outlets, all these outlets that with the digital revolution, make possible, use them to really disseminate knowledges that are not readily accessible sometimes in the formal educational system. And then thirdly, it's important in my view for us to be very intentional in creating research teams that are transnational, that involve a community of scholars that are not only like-minded in terms of discipline or interdisciplinary approaches, but that fundamentally, in terms of epistemology, they are and ideology interested in the agenda for the empowering, for the liberation, for the emancipation of African peoples. And one of the things I'm very, very keen on is ensuring that we have collaborative engagements between African institutions and HBCUs, for example, in this country, between African American academic communities and African academic communities to create this kind of epistemic culture that is Pan-African. And in that regard, I'm involved in two projects which may be of interest. One is a program we established, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I did research for them in 2011, 2012 on how African-born academics in Canada and the United States engage with African higher education institutions and research networks. And out of that project, we established the Carnegie Corporation, the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellows program that sponsors people from Canada, African-born academics from Canada and the US to go to Africa. So far, we have sponsored more than 500. We've given more than 500 fellowships to more than 150 universities in 6. We expanded to 9 countries 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, I and a group of friends, we created what we are calling the Consortium of African Diaspora Scholars Programs, which is registered in New York. We registered it in New York and registered it in Nairobi to provide a forum, a platform for engagement between the African diaspora as a whole, not just the African-born. So African Americans, Afro-Brazilians, Black French, Black British, you name it, to engage with African research networks, African universities, African organizations interested in knowledges of whatever type. It could be private companies, it could be NGOs, it could be civil society organizations, it could be universities, it could be anything, to mobilize this huge asset of the diaspora as an intellectual resource. We all know the diaspora is Africa's biggest donor in terms of remittances. 2 years ago, it was $84 billion, more than ODA, of overseas development assistance, more than the EU gives, more than the US, more than China, more than foreign investment, is the diaspora. And I believe very strongly the diaspora is Africa's biggest intellectual resource outside the continent itself. And we need to mobilize that. And through that mechanism, really strengthen, capacitate African institutions of knowledge much more than they are able to do by themselves. And also it leads to a way of internationalizing Africa in ways that are truly transformative, because I believe that the diaspora is really the eyes and ears, the global eyes and ears of Africa. And whatever differences may exist, there is a commonality of interest in our global condition, in our fate on this planet.
Which brings us, as we kind of, I can talk to you all day, and I'm sure our listeners can listen to you all day, but in the sake for time, but also in the sake that we obviously will bring you back. You just did what you are outlining here as, I want to make sure that we make these connections for our listeners. You gave a very important data point that Africa, the continental Africa, will have the largest labor population, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're actually also laying out is the fact that, this is a historical continuum, and how this look in the 21st century, we have an opportunity to control.
Yes.
We have an opportunity to control using the proper frameworks and methods and means to do that, right? So you also, what you're just, you a lot of times we do analysis of a problem, but don't necessarily give some type of framework that we can at least, and I want to make sure our listeners understood that, because what you're talking about here, you just laid out, has everything to do with controlling the intellectual labor that is being done, that also moves into the physical labor that needs to be done in the context of a global economy, or a global that's very militaristic. So what we're doing here is that we're looking at, a historical moment that is cyclical, right? There's a reinstitutionalization of a neo-colonialism, right? And I often, tend to, deal with these questions as well. This notion of a post. Are we in a post? Are we in a post apartheid? Are we in a post colonial? Are we? And I know Kwame Nkrumah, of course, neo-imperialism. Are we in a new imperialism? The methods of control are new, but the ideology is still there. And what you're proposing is to reinvigorate a pan-Africanism, which of course I'm leading to. You just gave actually our good comrade and colleague Moiza sent me a talk or a speech that you just did on Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. Did you just do that on, I think it was on the 25th of May?
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Could you talk a little bit about what you outlined there, because that's important as the backbone to what we have been discussing this whole entire time as well.
Yeah, so thank you again for that. So it seems to me, whatever we do, we have to pay attention to what the global trends. And there are some critical global trends that, whether we like it or not, affect us and will continue to affect us. And if we don't understand them, and if we don't do interventions that serve our interest, our interest will not be served. So the first one is really, you quoted it, Kwame Nkrumah. Yes, we live in a perpetual age of imperialism. Imperialism never ended, so that's why, I hear your point about post this, post that. I'm also hesitant to use post because it assumes you have overcome. Colonialism is not in the same way it used to function, but we all know from Fanon and onwards, neo-colonialism, Kwame Nkrumah talked a lot about that. So what are the contemporary contexts that we need to pay attention to? One is, of course, the sort of globalization, which, and globalization has gone into different phases. The current phase of the post-Cold War is of course, seems to be going backwards in terms of, deglobalization, decoupling between the two major economic powers, the US and China. And the issue there then becomes, what does that mean for the Pan-African world? And we need, in my view, to do very serious analysis of this. Because what you find historically is that moments of hegemonic rivalries, and there have been at least 3 major ones in the last 200 years, have an impact on us that is negative. So if you look at the hegemonic rivalry in Europe between Britain and France, Britain, the first industrial power, Germany, clawing on the, into overtaking Britain in the 19th century, that hegemonic rivalry led to the new imperialism, which meant for us in Africa, colonization. And of course, that also for Asia and so on and so forth. The second major moment of hegemonic rivalry was after World War II between the Soviet bloc and the NATO bloc, the Western bloc, led by the US. And that moment facilitated decolonization. It was in that global moment, very unique global moment, that decolonization took place. The question that we should ask ourselves, to what extent is the emerging rivalry, hegemonic rivalry, between the two economic superpowers, what does that mean for us? Does it hold opportunities for development? It's an open question. The other thing that is taking place is, of course, the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, the digitalization of biological, of physical systems. And that has huge implications for the nature of work, for production, for every industry, entertainment. We all know that, all these streaming services and all that stuff. What does the Fourth Industrial Revolution mean for Africa and for African peoples? To what extent are we producing, rather than simply consuming, technologies coming out of the Fourth Industrial Revolution? I gave a talk at the Economic Commission for Africa about 2-3 weeks ago on some of these questions. And I gave them one statistic, and that is high performance computing, which is really what is behind all this data analytics, big data, AI, robotics, you name it. It's really, you need very, very powerful systems of HPC, high performance computing. Africa's capacity is 0.2% of global HPC. Much of the HPC is controlled by the United States and China, a little bit in Europe. This is a question, because what will happen is that during the First Industrial Revolution, we participated in very centrally, but in terms of labor. The labor of our people built the economies of the Americas, which fed into the industrialization of Europe. And we got trinkets for it. The Second Industrial Revolution occurred during the colonial period. We contributed massively, but we sent raw materials and we got pittance for it. The current Industrial Revolution is data. And we are exporting our data to the so-called cloud, which are really huge, computer farms. And we're even paying for the privilege of that data being stored. We got to establish control in this very important arena of 21st century economies, if we are going to be what Ali Mazrui used to call players, rather than people who are acted upon pawns. So if we want to be players, we gotta take the Fourth Industrial Revolution seriously and invest in the architecture of that revolution, which also entails the digital diplomacy that is going on now, setting up the legal framework of the digital society, digital economy. Africa is absent in those arenas. And we also know that we are affected currently by Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the food shortages. Africa imported a lot of food from Ukraine and Russia. And this is destabilizing flows of food, fertilizer, and oil, oils and so on and so forth. And the question is, to what extent can we use this as an opportunity to build our agricultural systems resilience? in agriculture. And the opportunities are there. So all these big global questions are absolutely critical for us. And the biggest asset, in my view, we have is, of course, population. Development is not a question of natural resources, although that matters. Development is not a question of race or ethnicity, which used to be the racist arguments that only some people can develop and others are doomed to perpetual backwardness. That's racist nonsense. Development is really about the quality of your human capital, the quality of your institutions, the quality of social trust, the capital of social trust. And in terms of human capital, we have a huge advantage as a continent. The African population was only 9.3% of the global population in 1960. We did not reach the level of what Africa used to be in 1750 at the height of the slave trade until 2004, when we got to about 13.2% thereabouts of the world population. And in 2020, we got to 17.2% of the world population. By 2050, we are going to get to 25% of the world's population. By the end of the century, on current trends, Africa will have 40% of the world's population. So 4 out of every 10 human beings on this planet is going to be African. This is a huge development that I don't think has sunk in certainly to the rest of the world. And in Africa, we talk about the demographic dividend, but I don't think we are investing enough in turning this huge historic moment, historic asset into the kind of into the kind of dividend that it should be. And that means, frankly, investing heavily in education, investing heavily in skills development, in making sure that our young people have the best education they can get. It's a grounded education. It's an education that makes them able to live and work and develop that continent. The development of Africa will become indispensable, is indispensable, as W.B. Du Bois used to argue. It's indispensable for the development and for the respect of the diaspora. The Chinese today are not being mistreated in many parts of the world because there is China as a superpower. The Japanese were regarded, I'm not saying this was the right thing to do, but it shows you the dynamics of global power. The Japanese were regarded as honorary whites in South Africa during apartheid, when other Asians were not. It was because of the might of Japan. So Africa and the diaspora need to work together to ensure that this huge demographic dividend is one that we actually reap, instead of turning the population explosion into a demographic disaster, into a Malthusian nightmare of ill-educated, ill-skilled hundreds of millions of young people, which, if that becomes the case, then Africa becomes unlivable.
And we also know with those who have a supremacist idea what they would do to a population that is unusable.
Yes.
That becomes important as well.
That's right.
So, I would hate to, end this conversation, but there's so much here. And I just want to honor your time and that you wanted to provide for us today, as we think through these things together in community, in a global community. Again, thank you that was a great way to kind of, end, or I shouldn't say end, put a pin in our particular conversation. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope we do it again.
Yes, we definitely will. Thank you. Perfect.
All right. Bye-bye.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram @Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research content contributor and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Watterson, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.